I'm Rachel Mason.
And I'm Tyler Stubb.
And today we're actually sitting in studio with Sam Dunn. He is a Ph.D. candidate here at CSU. So welcome, Sam. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So just to start out, why don't you give us a little background about yourself?
Sure. I came to CSU about 3 years ago after I finished up my bachelor's degree at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. And here I'm working on my Ph.D. in the graduate degree program in Ecology. And I study greenhouse gas production, consumption, and transport in Arctic and alpine ecosystems. So hard to reach places, basically.
And what made you choose CSU for your Ph.D. graduate program?
That's actually a funny story in that when I decided I want to go to grad school, I did a Google search for graduate school and a couple other keywords that were related to my field of study, and this is one of the places I got a bunch of hits on, so I thought I'd check it out. It actually, when I interviewed, it was my last choice until I actually came out here and loved the town and the lab. So did not expect to be here, but here I am.
What got you so interested in ecology?
Also another long and convoluted story, but I'll skip most of that. So when I had to take a required science class as an undergrad. Actually, at the time I was a philosophy major, and I was taking my required lab course. And the professor, who actually got his master's and PhD degree here at CSU, started talking about nutrient cycling and ecosystems, and the technical term for that being biogeochemistry. And I really loved the quantitative nature of it. It almost seemed like solving a puzzle. And because it was a small school and you knew all your professors, I went and talked to some folks, and they put me to work in a lab, and the rest is history.
So jumping right into it, why don't you give us kind of a summary of what you're studying and what your project kind of entails?
All right. So I'll be in Siberia for 8 weeks this summer, and I'm going to be looking at how streams that are draining ecosystems are being affected by thawing permafrost. So the part of the world I'm going to is completely underlain by permafrost, anywhere from 10 meters deep to 400 meters deep, and it's been frozen for anywhere up to 30,000 years. And because of the warming, it's thawing out, and when it thaws out, it releases a lot of stuff, and we don't fully understand, how that is going to play out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to treat these streams as a kind of an index of what's going on in the larger watershed, because it can't be everywhere at once. But you can almost think about these streams as like, to give an analogy, like the reason why your doctor takes a urine sample is to tell a lot about what's going on in your body. The same idea can apply to ecosystems. Everything flows downhill, especially with water. So you can see what's in the water, you can tell a lot about what's going on all around you.
Okay. And for those listeners who don't know what permafrost is, what is that? Is that just ice, or?
Yeah, good question. So actually, for the longest time, people didn't actually believe it existed because no one lives where permafrost is. But the technical definition is that it's soil that's been frozen for 2 or more years. So some of the stuff, like I was saying, is thousands of years old. Some of it is newer. But more or less, it's frozen soil and frozen water in the soil.
Okay. And you mentioned that as the environment kind of warms, it releases gases. What are these gases?
Right. So the gases I study are carbon dioxide and methane, both of which are very potent greenhouse gases. Methane doesn't get as much press as carbon dioxide does because it's not nearly as common. It's maybe about 1/200th less common in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide is, but it's also 27 times more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide is. So these two gases are mainly made by microbes or other organisms living within soils or especially within wet areas. So when you go into a wetland or a swamp and you smell that kind of bad egg sulfury smell, that's because of the microbes that live there. They're very similar to the microbes that make this methane and make this CO2.
So you can, by looking at the river, you can see like how prevalent these gases might be in the air.
Right. Well, you can at least get an idea of how much of these gases are being made within this watershed. So other people have found in Canada and Alaska and some parts of Europe that all these streams in high latitudes, so I'm talking like 70 degrees north, high Arctic sort of thing, they're all super saturated with these gases. So they're constantly releasing these gases to the atmosphere. These streams become super saturated because they're being fed these gases by their surroundings, be it from groundwater that's carrying it with them, those gases being produced in the stream bed itself, etc. So if you look at a small stream and track how much gas gets accumulated over the course of some length and distance, you can get an idea of how much activity is going on within this watershed. And then using some satellite tools and remote sensing techniques, you can try and extrapolate that to the whole area.
I think when most people think of gases, they kind of associate that with the atmosphere and air in general. So why look at water for these gases?
That's a good question. So we have pretty decent measurements of these gases in the atmosphere, in the air. So there's been long-term observation of these at the South Pole, at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And these gases, we care about them once they get to the atmosphere. But if we can figure out how they get to the atmosphere or where they're coming from, can be really important for making management decisions. So there are researchers whose papers I cite and base my work on who spend their entire careers more or less building budgets for how much of these gases are being produced or consumed, where they're being transported to and from. Because some parts of the world will produce these gases, some parts of these worlds will consume these gases. It's very mixed. It varies a lot by space. So you really have to go to some place to really get an idea of how it's behaving in the sense, whether it's producing these gases or consuming these gases, and how sensitive that place is to any changes.
And how exactly are you quantifying these gases in the streams that you're looking at?
Okay. So one of the reasons why I came to CSU was the lab I'm in here. We use all laser-based methods to measure gases. So this is a new technology. You can measure things very quickly and very accurately. So when I am over in Siberia, I'll have a briefcase-size laser that measures the concentration of methane and carbon dioxide and water vapor every second or so. So I can carry that around with me, hike around for a few weeks at a time, and measure gases dissolved in the water, measure gases coming off of the water, gases being taken up by the soil nearby. More or less, I'll use this laser in a briefcase to measure as much of the atmosphere around that area as I can. So if you close off a space, let's say you have to take like a bucket, you put it on the ground, you have a closed space, and you can measure the accumulation or loss of these gases in that space over time by having the laser constantly resample and circulate the gas. You can get an idea of how much or what the rate of production or the rate of consumption of these gases are for that square meter or whatever it happens to be. Take enough of those measurements and you can say this watershed produces X number of grams of carbon dioxide per square meter per hour.
And so how big is the watershed that you're looking at?
I'll be looking at smaller streams. The watershed is, these small streams are tributaries to the Coloma River. The Coloma River is the biggest river in the world that's completely underlain by continuous permafrost. So it's very unique in that sense that it's a quite sizable river. By the time it reaches the Arctic Ocean, it's about 3 miles across. A lot of water moving through it, but all the water that drains into it is coming from ecosystems underlain by permafrost. The streams I'll be working on are much, much smaller. So I'm talking about the ones that if you were up hiking in the Rockies, you'd cross a little babbling brook, something around that size, maybe a meter or two across. Not very deep either. Those are the interesting ones. Those are the ones that are most connected to the landscape that they are draining.
And so why is that? Because I think that most people might associate bigger streams or rivers with carrying more things.
Right. So you're right that bigger streams and rivers, they do actually carry more things. But if you can imagine starting a hike at the top of a mountain, hiking down, following a river, as you go down and down and down, other smaller streams come and add to it. And over time, river that you're walking next to is the aggregate. It's the added total of a number of smaller rivers. And we want to get at what's going on in a very small area. We want to get as detailed information as possible. So we go to each of those small rivers and see what each of their contributions are and whether they add up to what we see in the big river. Some of it might not add up. There might be some other source we're missing. So we do the small rivers because that's where, to that's where the magic happens, I guess, in terms of gases being absorbed into the water, gases being released to the water. It's all in the smaller streams because they're very tightly connected to the land that they drain.
You kind of mentioned in your abstract briefly that the dissolved inorganic content, the carbon dioxide and the methane that you're looking at, that it's lost in tropical systems. You were kind of comparing them to Arctic systems.
Yeah.
So what exactly are those differences, and why is that so?
So the metric I was talking about was comparing to say behavior of a non-living thing, but the behavior of how these streams lose gas. I mentioned the ratio of how much is being lost downstream that's still dissolved versus how much is being released as a gas to the atmosphere. And in the Arctic, that ratio, how much is lost to the atmosphere and how much is lost downstream, is incredibly variable. And we don't know why it's very variable. For the tropics, a lot of work's been done in the Amazon. That's really started to take off more as well. It's been very consistent that there's a lot more, there's more downstream. So in these tropical streams, we see 6 times more of these gases transported downstream than released to the atmosphere. Whereas in the Yukon, another Arctic river, it's roughly 5 times more are released to the atmosphere than lost downstream. So almost the opposite. And that could have a lot to do with the physics of the river, how the water flows, things I really don't understand because I'm a biologist. But I would bet that it has to do with how these streams are being loaded and continuing sources of it. So you can imagine the biggest difference between a tropical ecosystem and an Arctic ecosystem is whether there's permafrost or not. I mean, among many other differences. But some of these streams are actually flowing right on top of the permafrost itself and eroding away at it slowly over time. And another misconception, I guess, about the Arctic is that it's actually very wet. So people think it doesn't really rain all that much, but because you have this layer of ice underneath everything, and you only have to dig down, as little as 10 centimeters as up to a couple meters before you hit ice. In the spring, when your snow melts or if you get a little bit of rain, it has nowhere to go. It just kind of sits there. It's almost like a giant bog of sorts, whereas the tropics, it drains fairly quick. It's wet, but the plants take up a lot, and the water can at least drain out the bottom over time. So I guess to answer your question, we don't really know why they're terribly different, but I'm hopefully going to try and figure that out a little bit.
So where does the methane come from exactly?
Yeah. So the methane is actually a waste product of microbes. So all living things, you, me, they have to produce some waste product in order to do metabolism, right? So we produce carbon dioxide. Lots of things produce carbon dioxide. But there are special types of organisms which can do anaerobic respiration. So when there's no oxygen available, i.e. you're in a stagnant bog, they can use other things instead of oxygen. And the byproduct of that for some microbes is methane, which is interesting because that is characteristically, that gas is very different than CO2 and the chemistry of it. So these microbes, they're not necessarily super common or super abundant, but by the time that they're able to produce methane, by the time conditions are right, they're the only ones left standing. All other options for other life forms have been exhausted. The only thing we can make is methane, which is why they're looking for methane on other planets, because if you're going to find life in an extreme environment, you're going to look for methane being produced. The Mars rover actually has a very similar instrument to what I use on it, because they're trying to find methane in the atmosphere or methane coming out of the soils on the surface of Mars. Where I'm going, while it may feel like Mars in terms of its isolation, it's a bit more hospitable for life. So
in the permafrost, in all that ice, are these microbes living, or are they just kind of frozen?
That's the really neat part. So only recently people have been able to see that in permafrost, in frozen soil and water, that you can still have microbial activity going on. So even though the temperature is like minus 10 degrees Celsius, there's still life kicking around, albeit very slowly, but it's still happening. So the current thought is that you can get these little pockets of water where it's salty enough that it's not at its freezing point yet. And these microbes are able to thrive in that environment. So any food they're able to get on, they can still metabolize. They can still make methane.
So if you're a Mars rover and you're searching for methane in the atmosphere, it's actually proof that there's life on Mars.
It would be a good sign of that. We know there's water on Mars. The Martian soil contains actually a very high amount of water. But they were thinking that the idea was that underneath the surface, a meter or so, there might be pockets of life that are still producing some gas, some methane.
So if these organisms are kind of living in these little pockets in the permafrost and kind of releasing CO2 or methane, depending on what kind of organism it is any of that gas kind of escaping the permafrost, or is it kind of stored in there?
Lots of that gas is escaping the permafrost. Okay. So a lot of it is stored as well, but the Arctic in general is a major source for both of these gases. So I actually had some numbers on that. So the permafrost contains more carbon than exists in all plant life and in the atmosphere today. That's the amount of carbon that's frozen in this permafrost. And one paper a few years ago found that permafrost thaw released in a 1.6 to 30-fold increase in carbon dioxide and methane emissions, respectively. So when this permafrost is degraded, there's just this massive, very rapid release of these gases. It'd be analogous to taking a frozen dinner or something out of your freezer and letting it sit out for a couple of days. You freeze it to keep your food from going bad, to prevent microbes or fungi or what have you from eating your food. When it gets warm enough, your food will go bad real fast because these microbes are capable of surviving these conditions. And as soon as it warms up enough, they're just going to be off to the races and metabolizing as quickly as they can. So there's a lot of gas coming out of these ecosystems. There's actually there's a really cool video online where this group at Alaska Fairbanks, who does work similar to what I do, they were collecting methane from bubbles frozen in a lake surface. So methane was still bubbling up and getting frozen into the ice. And when they broke the bubbles, they were able to light the bubbles on fire. So you get these huge explosive plumes coming out of the lake. What I'm doing is not quite that extreme, but when it freezes over, the places where I work, that is possible. They've done that there. They've lit these gases on fire, that's quite a bit of methane in order to light something on fire. I think it's roughly like 25,000 times what's in the atmosphere today to be flammable. So that's a lot of methane. They're really cranking.
Are there any particular streams or any areas in the watershed that you're studying that you think might have more of these gases or less?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm actually hoping to study a number of streams. So I'll be looking at streams that are draining a tundra ecosystem, streams draining a floodplain, streams draining a taiga forest. And there's even some streams that are draining exposed permafrost cliffs. So where the bigger river has been cutting through, it's actually exposed these, they're probably close to 200 meters tall ice cliffs, essentially. And there's little streams that look like the Chocolate River from Willy Wonka draining off the side of it. And as far as I know, no one's ever really measured what's coming off of that directly before. But you can imagine that might be a substantial amount of methane, or at least have the potential to produce a substantial amount of methane.
And that's because the larger river is kind of cutting into all of that stored.
Yep, it's cutting into a hillside as the river meanders over time. Right now it's cutting into this hillside where it was a very ancient hill built up basically of layers of ice upon dirt upon ice upon dirt, and that's all been laid bare. It's pretty extreme looking. And in these permafrost cliffs, we actually find mammoth bones and horse bones from the Pleistocene 20,000 years ago. We actually someone a couple years back found a mammoth tooth, which is about the size of a basketball. And there's a collection of tusks at the research station that they've collected over the years, just sticking out of the mud where this river's cut into this hillside. So this really is ancient material and ancient microbes being awakened. It's like zombies.
Right. So do they go dormant then?
Yeah. These microbes can go dormant for a long period of time. Some of them are active at very low levels, but dormants, they're tough buggers. They can last a long time under very adverse conditions.
How might these dormant microbes be different than what we currently have in our soil?
They're actually not that terribly different. They're actually, believe it or not, there hasn't been too much work done yet. I'm going to say emphasize yet on what these microbes look like at a genetic level. So until very recently, getting DNA from soil and being able to sequence it was close to impossible unless you really were really pushing on it. And it's there was a really big paper that came out a couple years ago where they're able to recreate a genome for one of these methane-producing microbes in the thawing permafrost. And that was the first time it was done, and it was published in Nature in 2011, I think. So as far as we can tell, they're definitely related, probably at least very similar to the microbes that exist today. But at the same time, you got to keep in mind that the idea of a species at this small of a level doesn't necessarily make sense because of how genes are transferred all the time. So we look more at what functional traits are present. So all microbes that have the ability to produce methane, we kind of lump into one group, and that's just based on a purely functional basis, that they do this for their metabolism as opposed to their rhizobium or their archaea of this sort or another.
Does the ability to map out the microbe's genome in the dirt help you?
I actually don't focus too much on the molecular stuff yet. I'm more interested in what's going on at the larger scale. So what is this ecosystem doing? So I would classify myself as a ecosystem ecologist.
Mm-hmm.
There are people I work with who would classify themselves as microbial ecologists, and they would really dive into more of what these microbes are capable of doing. So apart from the genes that allow them to produce methane, what other genes do they have? And if we have scenario X, so this amount of warming, this amount of food present, how do we think these microbes will respond? Whereas I'm asking, how will this ecosystem respond to scenario X?
And how do you personally think the ecosystem will respond to increased carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere and in the streams?
So the increased carbon dioxide and methane is actually the response that I'm expecting. So
okay.
the stimulus is that the amount of warming that occurs at high latitudes is far greater than what we experience here in Colorado. So while the global average temperature is supposed to go up about 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, the amount of temperature increase for the Arctic is closer to 7 degrees Celsius, whereas it's about 2 for the global average. So the rate of warming is far greater. So you can imagine cranking up your freezer 7 degrees and seeing what happens to all your frozen food, except this is covering millions of square kilometers that have been frozen for thousands of years. So there's a lot of possible outcomes, and we're trying to get a better idea of what is most likely. There's a very strong possibility that these ecosystems will become a very big source of these gases in the atmosphere, more so than they are already. If I remember correctly, they are already the biggest source of the atmosphere, even more so than humans, believe it or not. But that might increase drastically. It might not. It really depends on how things play out, how much warming there actually is. There's some considerations of what vegetation is present that could affect how much gas is released. If you have new plants come in that are really good at taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and haven't been able to live here before, it might offset it a lot. We really don't know yet. We're trying to figure that out.
So what is the worst case scenario? I mean, mind all the listeners that this is the worst case scenario. That might not mean it's realistic, but...
Yeah, the worst case scenario, I don't know who coined this term, but it's very grave sounding. The worst case scenario that I'm aware of is called the carbon bomb. So, yeah, which sounds pretty ominous. But there more or less would be an extremely large release of these gases in the atmosphere over the course of hundreds to maybe even 1,000 years, which we've seen in geological history cause mass extinctions, cause changes in the glaciation, deglaciation cycles. Someone in 2012, there's a paper published titled "Past Extreme Warming Events Linked to Massive Carbon Release from Thawing Permafrost." So that is the nightmare scenario, is that this massive release of carbon, which like I said, is more than exists in all of the land plants and the atmosphere already today, would drastically change our environment. But again, worst case scenario, not going to happen in our lifetimes, but that's kind of the nightmare.
That was actually not the worst case scenario I was imagining.
Oh, yeah.
That's a lot worse than.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Won't happen in my lifetime.
Yeah, there's still uncertainty associated with it. We know about how it's going to play out. We know that there's going to be warming, but we don't know what all the effects will be, and that's the really hard part.
But it goes to show how important permafrost is in just kind of a global ecology ecosystem kind of way.
Yeah. Without that being there, we'd be quite a bit warmer today. And as actually the way all that carbon got there in the first place, the current best guess is that this area, as far north as it was a massive grassland steppe ecosystem. So it was actually a very productive grassland that at some point was converted to this taiga forest, mossy, squishy, wet ecosystem. We're not really sure why they changed over, but there's if you dig down far enough, you can actually find fossilized grasses. You can find the old seed bank from this old grassland that was there when the woolly mammoth were roaming. Things change on planet Earth, and we don't often know why they change, but we are subject to
those changes.
Forces. These changes, these forces that are beyond our control or understanding.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier that the quantitative knowledge that you gain of exactly how much gas is being released can be really important for management decisions.
Yeah.
What kind of management decisions do you think need to be made with this knowledge?
Right. So there isn't really much in the way of management of the Arctic as there to speak of now. So they would allow for management to possibly to happen. So there's currently an experiment going on not far from where I'll be working, where they are trying to recreate that ancient grassland I just mentioned. So they bulldoze down the forest, and they have brought in grazers and they've let the permafrost thaw and reseed itself, and all these prairie plants these seeds are somehow still viable, which is kind of crazy. And it's thought that this might be a management option, is that we've created a new carbon sink. It removes more carbon than it produces in this environment, and that might be a possible management application. Other management things may be oil and natural gas resources are in the area. If disturbance from trucking or setting up rigs or what have you could enhance or deplete how much methane is being produced or how much or carbon dioxide is being produced, that might be worth considering as well. But it's kind of like the Wild West of the world, in that there's not much going on there, and there's not much to manage at this point because it's such a hostile environment. So all the more reason to pay attention to it, because just because you're not aware of what's going on in Yakutia, which is this province in northeastern Russia, what happens there can still affect us here at home in the long run, regardless of whether we are able to manage it or even know about it in the first place.
So is there anything that anyone can do now to kind of prevent the release of these gases?
Not really, unfortunately. I wish I had a better answer for you there, but the release of this gas is on such a grand scale and is influenced by so many things that happen at a global level that, biking to work instead of taking the bus is a great idea. It saves you money. It's great for your health. You put less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but there's already enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to continue warming, to keep the warming going for a long time. So even if we cut off everything right now, it's still going to keep warming up for centuries because there's already enough present. So not to discourage people from trying to have better behavior, but to answer your question, there's not terribly much we can do apart from trying to adapt to it as in a responsible way. So that could be anything from new technologies. People throw around geoengineering or climate engineering to some extent. So, mimicking volcanic eruptions and decreasing the amount of light that hits the Earth, all sorts of mad scientist-esque plots, which, in theory work, but yeah, that's a really tough question. I'm glad I'm not in the public policy side of things, because that's, people's livelihoods will be affected by this, and that's tough to deal with.
So we're about at time right now. So a few closing questions for you, Sam.
All right.
How far do you hope to take this research that you're doing?
So the research that I'm doing this summer is for my dissertation here, but I'd like to keep on doing research in Arctic and alpine environments for as long as I can. So long run, I want to be a professor and focus on teaching, and if I can take students with me to do projects like these, which is how I got involved in the first place in working in Russia, that'd be great. Continuing to let people know about what's going on, apart from it being a good science story, and there's lots of very good science going on here. It's also a cultural story as well, because people have been living here for a very long time. And to see the more immediate effects of this permafrost thaw in their daily lives, crumpled buildings, railways buckling, that sort of thing. That's another story that needs to be told. And then finally, to get onto my soapbox, I'm a child of science, and I want to more or less try to learn something new every day. And right now I get paid to do that, which is pretty nice. So even if I'm not working on permafrost, just to take what I learn here and keep moving forward with improving mankind's or humankind's understanding of how our planet works.
Perfect. Thanks again, Sam, for sitting in with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, and for those listeners out there listening in for the first time, you can find us every Sunday from 4 to 5 p.m. on 90.5 KCSU. Again, this is Science CSU, your radio laboratory. I'm Rachel Mason.
And I'm Tyler Stubb.
And we'll see you next time.